The only thing she left behind on the empty table was a single $100 bill and a note, "You will figure it out." Quietly slipping that bill under the sole of my shoe, I accepted having nothing and started over from scratch. 10 years later, the son who had betrayed me stood on the brink of bankruptcy. For the first time, he searched my name online, then called his mother in a panic. Over the next 48 hours, I received 113 missed calls, crying and begging. I am so grateful to have you here with me. Let's connect. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. Also, please note, this narrative blends factual inspired lessons with fictional elements for entertainment and educational value. Any resemblance to actual people or places is purely coincidental, but the core message remains highly useful. The morning of my 65th birthday, I came home to a house that no longer belonged to me or to anyone who had ever loved me. I had left early that morning before 7, the way I always did on weekdays. Old habit from 40 years of clocking in before the shift supervisor. I walked the neighborhood loop I had been walking for 11 years down Magnolia Street, left on Briarcliff through the quiet stretch of oak trees that lined the back end of our block. The kind of walk a man takes when he still believes the world is more or less in order. It took me 45 minutes. I came back to find the driveway empty and the front door unlocked. The moving trucks had come and gone before sunrise. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I stepped inside. The living room was bare, not messy bare. Clean lines on the hardwood where the sofa had sat for over a decade. Rectangular shadows on the wall where the picture frames used to hang. Our wedding photo. Julian's Little League portrait. The framed print of the Georgia coast that Victoria had picked out at a flea market in Savannah the summer we turned 40. All of it gone. Lifted out of the house like it had never been there, like the whole 26 years of it had been a stage set someone had quietly struck overnight. I walked through every room. I don't know exactly why. I think some part of me was still expecting to find something. Some explanation, some note slipped under a door that would make the geometry of the morning add up. The bedroom was stripped to the mattress frame. The bathroom had a single bar of soap on the sink edge left behind, the way you leave behind something too small to bother with. The guest room was empty. Julian's old room was empty, though that had been the case for years. He had moved to New York long before this morning, built his own life there. And I had told myself that was a good thing for a man his age. Julian had come late into our marriage. Victoria and I had nearly given up on having children when she told me she was pregnant at 39. We were 40 and 41 when he was born. And I had spent the first years of his life believing that made the whole thing more precious, not less. I was wrong about a number of things. In the kitchen, the counters were wiped clean. The coffee maker was gone. The table was bare, except for one item sitting in the exact center of the surface, placed with a deliberateness that told me it had not been forgotten. A single $100 bill. I picked it up, turned it over. On the back, written in red ink in Victoria's handwriting, the same looping script I had watched sign birthday cards and grocery lists, and our marriage certificate were 6 words. "You will figure it out." I stood there in my empty kitchen and read those words 3 times. Then I set the bill back down on the table and went to the sink and ran cold water over my wrists the way my father used to tell me to do when I needed to think straight. I stood there until the water went lukewarm. Then I turned it off, dried my hands on my jeans, and picked the bill back up. I want to be clear about something. I was not a wealthy man that morning. I was a retired mechanical engineer with a pension that Victoria had co-managed for years, the details of which I would not fully understand until much later. What I did have on that kitchen table was $100, and a clarity of mind that comes only when every single illusion has been removed at once. I thought about Victoria. We had met in 1983 at a company barbecue, and I had believed for most of those years that I understood the kind of woman she was. I was thorough with machines. I was less thorough with people. The house had been in her name for the last 4 years. She had asked me to sign the transfer paperwork, told me it was for estate planning purposes, and I had signed it. I didn't know it that morning, but she had already sold the property and emptied our accounts to fund a new life with her lover, without reading the fine print. That was on me. I thought about Julian, 35 years old, living in New York, running a company called Apex Components that I knew very little about beyond what he told me at Christmas. He had called on my birthday 2 years running, but not this year. I had assumed he was busy. I was right about that, at least. I put the $100 bill in my front pocket and walked out to the garage. The garage was the one room in the house that had not been fully emptied. Stacked against the back wall were 3 boxes of old engineering manuals and technical journals that dated back to my first job out of Georgia Tech. And in the corner, half hidden behind the boxes, sat my small experimental kiln, a compact electric furnace I had built by hand over the course of 2 years, in my spare time, designed for testing ceramic battery components at controlled temperatures. It was not a beautiful piece of equipment. It was bolted together from salvaged parts and repurposed industrial fittings, and Julian had once kicked it with the toe of his shoe and said it looked like junk science from a junk man. He had been 29 at the time, and very sure of himself. Nobody had taken the kiln. I wasn't sure if that was because they hadn't seen it, or because they hadn't thought it was worth anything. I crouched down and ran my hand along the side of it. The metal was cold and dusty. I stood back up, went inside, took the $100 bill out of my pocket, and found a small piece of clear plastic wrap in the one kitchen drawer that had been left behind, the junk drawer, the one nobody ever cleans out. I wrapped the bill carefully, folding the plastic tight around the edges, and tucked it into the inner lining of my left shoe, flat against the sole. I didn't do it out of anger. I want to be clear about that too. I did it because of something I couldn't have articulated yet. A low, quiet feeling at the base of my chest, like the first sign of pressure before a system builds. The instinct of an engineer, maybe. You protect the thing you might need later, even when you don't know yet what you'll need it for. I didn't know it then, but that piece of plastic was the most important investment decision I would make for the next 10 years. 7 days after my 65th birthday, I was sleeping on a park bench in Piedmont Park with my engineering notebooks tucked under my head like a pillow. The Atlanta October is not the brutal kind of cold that kills you in your sleep. It is the slow, patient kind, the kind that seeps through a jacket by 2 in the morning and settles into your joints by 4, so that by the time the sun comes up, you are stiff in ways that remind you exactly how old you are. I lay there that first week, listening to the city wake up around me, the distant rumble of delivery trucks on 10th Street, the first birds starting up in the oak trees overhead, the occasional jogger whose footsteps would slow as they passed my bench before picking back up again. Nobody stopped. In a city the size of Atlanta, a man lying on a park bench at dawn is just part of the landscape. I had left the house on Magnolia Street the same afternoon. Victoria's note sent me to the garage. I took 3 things: my old canvas backpack, the 2 engineering notebooks I had been filling for the better part of 6 years, and the experimental notes on polymer battery cells I had been developing in my spare time. 47 pages of calculations, diagrams, and failure logs that I had typed and printed at the public library the previous spring. I rolled those pages carefully and slid them into a cardboard tube I found in the recycling bin, then wrapped the tube in a plastic bag and strapped it to the inside of the backpack with a bungee cord. The notebooks and the research notes were the only things in that house that were genuinely mine. Everything else had Victoria's fingerprints on it one way or another. The first 3 days were the worst. I tried calling Julian on the second day, standing outside a convenience store on Ponce de Leon Avenue, with a prepaid phone I bought with $12 of the cash I had in my wallet. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His recorded voice was crisp and professional, the voice of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that warmth was a liability. "You've reached Julian Vance. Leave a message." "Julian," I said, and then I stopped. My throat tightened in a way I hadn't expected, not grief exactly, more like the physical sensation of swallowing something too large. I cleared my throat. "It's your father. I'm sure you know what happened. I wanted to hear your voice, son, that's all. Call me back when you can." He never called back. I stood outside that convenience store for a good 10 minutes after I hung up, hand pressed flat against the brick wall chest, doing something complicated that I did not have the vocabulary for at the time. A woman pushing a stroller gave me a long look as she passed, and I straightened up and nodded at her, like I was just a man taking a rest between errands. She didn't look convinced. I wasn't either. By the fourth day, I had found my footing in the practical sense at least. There was a cluster of electronics recycling depots on the south end of the city, places where old circuit boards, dead laptop batteries, stripped wire bundles, and every species of broken consumer device went to wait out their afterlife. I had known about these places from my engineering days, when I would sometimes scavenge components for prototype work rather than order new parts. The man who ran the largest one, a heavy-set fellow named Dale with a long gray beard and a University of Georgia cap he wore in every season, recognized the look of a man who knew what he was doing around electronics. "You need work or you need parts?" Dale asked the first morning I showed up, squinting at my backpack. "Both if you've got it," I said. Dale crossed his arms and looked me over with the unhurried assessment of a man who had seen every variety of hard luck walk through his gate. "You got a background. Mechanical engineer, 40 years, retired." He uncrossed his arms. "Retired," he repeated like the word tasted unusual. "All right. I got a pile of dead inverters in the back that nobody's been able to diagnose. You fix 3 of them, I'll pay you in cash and let you take whatever spare components you can carry." "Deal," I said. I fixed all 5 that were in the pile. It took me most of the day crouched on an overturned milk crate with a borrowed multimeter and a soldering iron that had seen better decades. My knees ached by noon, and my hands cramped twice, but there is a particular kind of satisfaction in fixing something broken that I have never been able to replicate in any other part of life. Each inverter that hummed back to life felt like a small argument won against the general disorder of things. Dale counted out $60 in cash at the end of the afternoon and let me fill my backpack with components: old lithium cells in various states of discharge, copper wire, a handful of ceramic insulators that made my pulse jump when I saw them. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "Same time tomorrow," I said. That became my week. Mornings at Dale's depot, or one of the 2 smaller yards nearby. Afternoons on a bench in Piedmont Park, spreading my research notes across my knees and writing new calculations in the margins while the October light lasted. Evenings eating whatever I had bought with the day's cash, usually something from the corner store on Monroe Drive, eaten slowly on the bench, because I had learned that eating slowly made it feel like more. One night it rained so hard the park became a river of mud and running water, and I took shelter under the I-85 overpass with a loose group of other men who had nowhere better to be. A man named Gerald, somewhere in his 50s, with a voice like gravel and a laugh that came easy, looked at my research notes spread across my lap in the half-dark and shook his head slowly. "Man," Gerald said, "what is all that?" "Battery research," I said. Gerald stared at me. Then he let out a laugh so loud it echoed off the concrete above us. "Battery research," he repeated, slapping his knee. "Brother, you are sleeping under a bridge doing battery research." "That's correct," I said. Gerald laughed again, and this time I laughed too, a real laugh, the kind that starts somewhere deep and comes out before you can think about it. My eyes went hot and wet at the corners, and I blinked hard twice because I was not going to cry under a highway overpass, not that night. but the laughter felt like something breaking loose inside my chest, some locked-up thing that had needed air. I wrote 3 new pages of notes that night by the light of Gerald's phone. On the 7th morning, a Fulton County patrol car pulled up to the park entrance, and an officer climbed out, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-60s with close-cropped gray hair and the careful movements of someone who had spent a long time in the job. He introduced himself as Chief Harrison, said he had seen me in the park a few mornings running. "You got somewhere to be, sir?" Harrison asked. Not unkind, just straight. "Working on it," I said. Harrison nodded at that like it was an answer he respected. Then his expression shifted, something in his jaw tightened, and he looked at me with what I can only describe as professional sympathy, the kind that has seen too much to be surprised, but still feels it. "I need to let you know," he said, "the property at 2247 Magnolia Street was transferred to new ownership as of this morning. Official sale went through county records at 9 a.m. The words landed in my stomach like cold water. I had known it was coming. I had known it the moment I stood in that empty kitchen a week ago. But knowing a thing is coming and hearing it spoken aloud by a county official in a parking lot are 2 entirely different experiences. My hands tightened around the strap of my backpack until my knuckles ached, and for one long moment, the park, the patrol car, Harrison's face, all of it went slightly out of focus. Then I took a breath, stood up straight. "Thank you for letting me know, Chief." Harrison studied me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You take care of yourself," he said finally, and there was something in the way he said it, not pity, but a kind of acknowledgement, one older man to another, that I held on to for the rest of that day. I picked up my backpack and walked toward the park gate without looking back at the bench. I had nothing left in Atlanta. But I had started to hear a name, Detroit, a city of broken things that people had given up on. I understood that city better than I understood anything else in my life. 3 years on the streets of Atlanta taught me things no engineering degree ever could. By the time I walked into that small bank branch on Peachtree Street in October of 2017, I had learned to read people the way I read circuit diagrams, and the look on that loan officer's face told me everything was about to get a great deal worse before it got better. I had gone in for something simple. After 3 years of cash work at Dale's Depot and a handful of other repair jobs across the city, I had saved just over $400, enough, I thought, to open a basic checking account and start receiving payments by transfer rather than counting out bills in a parking lot. I had my ID. I had my Social Security card. I had everything a man needed to open an account. What I did not have, it turned out, was a clean credit file. The loan officer, a young woman named Brenda according to her nameplate, with the tightly controlled expression of someone delivering bad news for the 3rd time that morning, typed my information into her terminal, waited, and then looked up at me with something between sympathy and practiced distance. "Mr. Vance," she said carefully, "I'm showing a significant derogatory item on your file. There's an outstanding loan of $500,000 originated in New York flagged for default. Until that's resolved, I can't open a standard account." I felt the floor shift slightly under my feet, the way it does when your body understands something before your mind catches up. $500,000, I repeated. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "When was this loan originated?" Patricia looked at her screen. "October 14th, 2014. October 14th, 2014. I gripped the edge of the counter with both hands, not because I needed the support, but because I needed something solid to hold on to, while the pieces rearranged themselves in my head. October 14th, 2014 was the day I had been picked up by a Fulton County patrol officer for sleeping in Centennial Olympic Park, not Piedmont, a different bench, a different week, and held at the Fulton County station for just under 24 hours, while they processed paperwork and confirmed I had no outstanding warrants. I had spent that night on a cot in a holding area that smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee, reading the same page of my battery notebook 6 times because I could not concentrate. While I was sitting on that cot in Atlanta, someone had walked into a bank in New York and signed my name to a $500,000 loan. Brenda, I said, I need you to write down the originating bank, the branch location, and the exact timestamp on that loan. Every detail you can give me. She hesitated. Sir, I'm not really supposed to. I was in police custody in Atlanta when that loan was signed, I said, and I kept my voice level and my hands flat on the counter because I knew that the moment I showed how hard my heart was hammering, this conversation would end. I have documentation. I need those details so I can begin the process of disputing it. Patricia looked at me for a long moment. Then she printed a single sheet and slid it across the counter without another word. I thanked her, folded the sheet into my breast pocket, and walked out onto Peachtree Street into the gray October morning. I sat down on a bus stop bench 2 blocks away and pressed both palms against my knees to stop them from shaking. My chest felt like something had reached inside and twisted. 3 years. They had done this 3 years ago, the same week Victoria left, the same week I was at my lowest, and they had done it knowing exactly where I was and exactly what I could not do about it from a police holding cell. The calculating of it. That was what hit me hardest. Not the betrayal I had been processing that for 3 years. It was the cold, deliberate timing. The fact that someone had looked at the calendar, looked at my situation, and chosen that specific day to put $500,000 of debt in my name. I pulled myself upright, rolled my shoulders back, and walked to the Fulton County Precinct on Pryor Street. Harrison was at his desk when I came in, the same broad-shouldered man with the gray crew cut I had first met in Piedmont Park 3 years prior. He had seen me a handful of times since then, usually when a patrol officer flagged me for loitering, and Harrison came out to handle it personally, which I had always taken as a kind of unofficial courtesy extended to a man he had decided deserved it. He looked up when I walked in, and something in my face made him set down his coffee immediately. Vance, he said. What happened? I need a certified copy of my intake record from October 14th, 2014, I said. The 24-hour hold, every timestamp you have. Harrison's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward in his chair. What did they do? I laid Patricia's printout on his desk without a word. Harrison picked it up. Read it. His jaw tightened slowly, the way a man's jaw tightens when he is angry, but has spent enough years in the job to know that anger without action is just noise. He set the paper down, stood up, and walked to the filing cabinet in the corner of the room. I keep physical copies of all detention records going back 15 years, he said, flipping through the drawer with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly where everything was. Department policy is 7 years, but I keep 15. You never know. He pulled a manila folder, opened it on his desk, found the page, and fed it into the copy machine against the wall. The machine hummed and spit out a sheet. Harrison picked up a rubber stamp, the official Fulton County seal, pressed it onto an ink pad, and stamped the copy with a clean, deliberate motion. He handed it to me across the desk and pointed at the timestamp at the top of the page. October 14th, 2014. Intake 11:47 a.m. Release October 15th, 2014, 10:22 a.m. That's a government document, Harrison said, his voice low and firm. Time-stamped. Sealed. Whoever signed that loan in New York at... He checked Patricia's printout. At 3:15 p.m. on October 14th was not you, because you were sitting in my holding cell at 3:15 p.m. on October 14th. Yes, I said. Harrison looked at me steadily. Are you going to do something with this? Eventually, I said. He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded once, a slow, deliberate nod that said he understood more than I had explained and respected the distance I was keeping from the rest of it. You need anything else from me, you come back, he said. I know where to find you. I said. Outside, I sat in the passenger seat of Harrison's old patrol car that he waved me into so I could get out of the rain, a rusting Crown Victoria that smelled of pine air freshener and decades of county service. The rain drummed against the roof in long, uneven bursts. I held the certified copy in both hands and looked at the timestamp, and for the first time in 3 years, something that felt dangerously close to a smile pulled at the corner of my mouth. I folded that document and tucked it carefully alongside my battery research notes in the cardboard tube inside my backpack. 2 pieces of paper. One described a crime committed against me. The other described everything I had been building in spite of it. I didn't know yet that together, they would one day walk a group of very powerful people straight into a federal holding cell. Years later, when Marcus laid a thick manila folder on my desk and said he had been a child when Victoria left, too young to understand what had happened and too far removed from our household to have been told the truth about it. He had found me the way a lot of things found me eventually, through the engineering forums where I posted technical papers under an anonymous handle. He had recognized my writing style from something his father once showed him, cross-referenced the battery research with my background, and driven 12 hours from Ann Arbor to Detroit, with a law degree in his hand and a look on his face like a man who had been rehearsing a conversation for a very long time. That day, he walked into my shipping container workshop, introduced himself, and said simply, "I know who you are. I know what happened. And I've spent the last 8 months building a file." I had looked at him for a long moment. This young man with my brother's eyes and his own particular brand of quiet intensity, and felt something crack open in my chest that I had kept sealed for years. Not grief. Something closer to relief. The particular relief of no longer being the only person in the world who knew the shape of what had been done to you. Now sitting in the Vance Green Tech office with the manila folder open between us on the desk, I understood the full shape of it for the first time. "Walk me through it," I said. "From the beginning." Marcus pulled the first page from the folder and set it in front of me. His jaw was tight the way it got when he was containing something he did not want to show. "They started the paperwork 6 weeks after you left Atlanta," he said. "October 2014. Victoria filed a petition in Georgia probate court, claiming you were showing signs of severe cognitive decline." I looked at the page. At the top, in clean printed type, were the words, "In re-guardianship of David R. Vance. Petitioner Victoria A. Sterling Vance." My name, my file, my alleged deterioration documented in someone else's handwriting. Something hot and sharp moved through my chest. Not quite rage, but the immediate ancestor of it. I pressed my hand flat on the desk surface and focused on the coolness of the wood. "She used the conversations," Marcus continued, his voice low and precise. "The ones you had at the dinner table. About the battery research. About supermolecular polymer chains and next-generation energy storage. She presented those conversations to the court as evidence of delusional thinking." He paused. "She took your work, the thing you loved most, and used it to make you look like you'd lost your mind." I heard those words and felt the heat in my chest rise all the way to the back of my throat. My hands tightened into fists on the desk. For a moment I could not speak, and what I felt was not sadness. It was a white-edged fury, the kind that comes when someone takes the best thing you have and weaponizes it. "The doctor," I said when I could trust my voice again. "Who signed it?" Marcus pulled a second page. "Dr. Arthur Pendleton. Ran a private neurological practice in Manhattan. The file shows he conducted a single 2-hour evaluation and diagnosed you with moderate to severe dementia with delusional ideation." Marcus's voice dropped half a register. "There's no record of a follow-up, no second opinion, no independent review." "Because there was no real diagnosis," I said. "No," Marcus said. "There wasn't." He looked at me directly, and his eyes were bright with an anger he was no longer bothering to fully contain. Pendleton's practice received 6 payments from a shell account connected to Julian's company between October 2014 and March 2015. One of those payments was made 14 days before he signed your diagnosis. The payments stopped the month after the guardianship was granted. I sat back in my chair. The ceiling of the office was high and white and completely ordinary, and I stared at it for a moment because I needed something ordinary to look at. They had used my own mind as the crime scene. The guardianship, I said. What did it give her? Full legal authority over your shared financial accounts, Marcus said. He pulled a third page, a court order from the Fulton County Probate Court, stamped and signed by a judge whose name I did not recognize. Once the court appointed her your legal guardian, she had the right to manage your assets on your behalf. She used that authority to liquidate the joint retirement fund. He set the final document in front of me. A withdrawal statement. $2,140,000. Taken in a single transaction on March 4, 2016. The penalty for early contract termination. The fund was a structured annuity, not a standard account, which meant breaking it early triggered a 30% fee had cost Victoria over $600,000. She had paid it without hesitation. She paid $600,000 just to get the money immediately, I said. Yes, Marcus said. And she didn't leave alone. The transfer logs show the money went straight into offshore accounts managed by Christian Pierce. He wasn't just the financial broker handling Julian's company, he was her lover. Julian knew about the affair, and he helped them hide the money so Pierce would fund his business. I looked at that number for a long time. Outside the office window, Detroit was doing what it always did in early spring, trying hard to be something more than it had been the previous winter. A crane was moving somewhere down the block, its arm swinging slowly across a pale gray sky. There's something else, Marcus said quietly. He reached for the folder. Julian was in the room when Pendleton delivered the guardianship ruling. Pierce was there too. He pulled a photograph, a scanned copy of a handwritten note, in what I recognized as Julian's handwriting, found in a document cache Marcus had obtained through a contact at the court clerk's office. The note read, "The old man's gone. Now we build something real." My son had written those words about me. I looked at that note for a long moment, and I will not pretend it did not hurt. It hurt the way very few things in my life have hurt, not in the chest, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that does not have a clean anatomical name. Julian had been 30 years old when he wrote those words. I thought about the boy I had taught to read a circuit diagram on the kitchen table, the boy who had fallen asleep on my shoulder watching football, the boy I had carried to bed more times than I could count. That boy had written, "The old man's gone." I closed the folder slowly. "How far does the Georgia court order reach?" I asked. "That's the thing," Marcus said, and for the first time since he had sat down, the ghost of something not quite a smile but its structural cousin moved across his face. "It doesn't reach Michigan. A Georgia guardianship order has no automatic legal force in another state. The moment Vance Greentech was incorporated in Michigan, you operated entirely outside their jurisdiction. They built their case on Georgia law, and you built your company in a state where that case doesn't exist." I let that land. "And you filed the competency confirmation here?" I asked. "Filed and recorded with the Wayne County Circuit Court 8 months ago," Marcus said. "Your legal capacity in Michigan is airtight. They cannot touch it." I nodded slowly, processing the geometry of it. They had tried to erase me on paper, and the paper had only reached so far. "But Marcus," I said, "you told me there was more. At the bottom of the folder." I looked at my great-nephew across the desk. This young man who had driven 12 hours to find me, who had spent 8 months building a case no one had asked him to build, and felt that cracked open feeling in my chest again, wider now. "Show me," I said. Marcus reached for the bottom of that folder, and I held up my hand. "Before you show me the rest," I said, "let me tell you where I was while they were building all of this." Marcus stopped. He looked at me across the desk with that careful stillness of his, the kind that meant he was listening with everything he had. Because I want you to understand something, I continued. What they did in those files, the doctor, the guardianship, the money, all of that happened while I was doing something else entirely. And I think that matters. I leaned back in my chair and looked past Marcus at the window at the Detroit skyline in the middle distance, gray and industrial and stubbornly alive. Let me take you back, I said, to a rust-stained shipping container on the east side of this city, November 2017. I arrived in Detroit on a Tuesday morning with $43 in my pocket, a backpack full of engineering notebooks, and a cardboard tube of battery research notes I had been carrying for 3 years. The Greyhound from Atlanta dropped me at the Michigan Avenue station just before 8 a.m., and I stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, with my breath making small clouds in the air, and looked at the city around me. Detroit had been through its own particular kind of devastation. Factories shuttered, neighborhoods hollowed out, buildings that had once been full of life standing empty against the sky like the bones of something that used to breathe. People who had never been here saw only the collapse. I saw something different. I saw a city that had been told it was finished and had decided without much fanfare to keep going anyway. I understood that city in my bones. A man at the bus station, a retired auto worker named Clifton Heavyset, with a Detroit Lions jacket, and the easy generosity of someone who had once been down himself, noticed me studying a handwritten list of addresses I had copied from a library computer in Atlanta. Industrial rental properties, cheap ones. You looking for workspace? Clifton asked, nodding at my list. Something I can afford with cash month to month, I said. Clifton scratched the back of his neck, thinking. My cousin rents out a couple shipping containers on Graciette Avenue, East Side. Nothing fancy, no heat, no running water, but it's got power and a concrete pad. $120 a month. Can I see it today? I asked. Clifton pulled out his phone and made the call right there on the sidewalk. The container was exactly what it sounded like. 8 feet wide, 20 feet long walls that sweated rust along the seams, a single industrial light fixture bolted to the ceiling. The concrete pad outside was cracked and stained with decades of automotive work. There was no insulation. In November in Detroit, the difference between the temperature inside and outside the container was approximately 4 degrees. I rented it on the spot. The first 2 months were about rebuilding from scratch. I had my research notes, my notebooks, and the knowledge of every failure I had accumulated over 6 years of spare time experimentation in Atlanta. What I did not have was equipment. I spent those months the way I had spent my time at Dale's Depot, trading labor for components haunting the industrial salvage yards that dotted the east side of Detroit, learning which yards had the best ceramic insulator stock and which ones let you stay past dark if you were quiet about it. There was a man at one of those yards, a young guy named Terrence, barely 25, with quick hands and a natural instinct for electronics that reminded me of myself at his age, who would sometimes stop what he was doing and watch me work. "What are you building, man?" Terrence asked one afternoon, watching me sort a box of recovered lithium cells by discharge rate. "A battery," I said. "What kind?" "The kind that doesn't exist yet," I said. Terrence stared at me for a second, then broke into a grin so wide it changed his whole face. "All right, old-timer," he said. "I respect it." By spring of 2018, I had a functional workbench, a rebuilt temperature-controlled kiln, assembled from salvaged parts, using the same design I had developed in the Atlanta garage, the same one my son had once called junk science, and a growing collection of test cells in various states of experimental modification. I had also established a routine at the Detroit Public Library on Woodward Avenue, where I would arrive 3 mornings a week when the doors opened, take the same terminal in the back corner, and post my research findings anonymously to a small community of engineers and materials scientists who congregated on a specialized technical forum. I never used my real name. I signed my posts with a handle, nothing meaningful, just a random string of numbers I had chosen because it was easy to remember. But my writing was precise and detailed, and over time it developed what I was told later was a distinctive voice. I did not know anyone was paying particular attention. I was simply doing what I had always done, putting the work out into the world, and trusting that it would find whoever needed to find it. The winters in Detroit were longer and harder than anything Atlanta had prepared me for. There were nights when the temperature inside the container dropped low enough that I wore my coat while I worked breath-fogging in the lamplight, fingers going stiff around my tools. I learned to keep a thermos of hot coffee going at all times, learned to work in gloves with the fingertips cut off, learned to recognize the specific kind of mental clarity that comes from being cold enough that your mind sharpens to a point just to keep you moving. I failed 214 times before I succeeded. I kept a failure log, a separate notebook, nothing but dated entries describing what had gone wrong, why I believed it had gone wrong, and what I intended to try differently. 214 entries. Some of them were small failures, incremental misfires in the charging cycle. Some of them were large test cells that vented gas and had to be destroyed prototypes that held charge for 20 hours and then dropped to zero overnight with no detectable cause. Each failure cost me time and salvage materials I had spent days accumulating. Each failure was also a page in the notebook that told me with scientific precision exactly what not to do next. In early 2021, a Thursday afternoon in February, gray sky pressing low over the container roof, I connected the 48th prototype cell to a small test lamp, noted the time in my log, and went to get coffee from the thermos. I came back and the lamp was still on. I sat down on my work stool and watched it. 1 hour. 2 hours. I ate dinner a sandwich from the corner store 2 blocks away, and the lamp was still on. I fell asleep in the chair at some point around midnight with the lamp burning in front of me. I woke at 5:30 in the morning to gray Detroit dawn coming through the seam in the container door. The lamp was still on. I checked my watch. 37 hours of continuous discharge. I pulled out my notebook and wrote the number down with hands that would not quite stay steady, my pen skipping twice on the page. By the time I reached 72 hours, 3 full days, the lamp never dimming the cell, holding its charge with a stability I had never achieved in any previous prototype, I had stopped writing in the notebook altogether. I just sat in front of that lamp and wept. Not dramatically, not the kind of crying that announces itself. The quiet kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere so deep you do not know it is there until it is already happening. My shoulders shook once, twice. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and breathed through it until it passed. Then I went to the library. I wrote up my methodology in a post that was longer and more detailed than anything I had published before: cell composition, charge cycling, protocol, temperature, variance, data, 72-hour, discharge results. I uploaded it to the forum at 7:43 in the morning, walked back to the container, and slept for 14 hours. 3 weeks later, sitting at that same library terminal on a Wednesday morning, I found an email in the anonymous account I had set up for forum correspondence. The sender address was a string of letters and numbers that told me nothing. The message was 4 sentences long. I have been reading your posts for 2 years. The 72-hour result is not something I can ignore. I would like to see the battery in person. Please respond if you are willing. I read those 4 sentences 3 times. I had no idea who had sent that email. I only knew one thing: whoever it was, they had read every single word I had written over 2 years of anonymous posts, and they had waited until they had seen something worth acting on before reaching out. That kind of patience either meant a very serious investor or a very serious trap. I stared at that screen for a long time before I typed a single word back. 3 weeks after I sent that reply, a woman I had never seen before walked into my shipping container, wearing heels that cost more than my monthly rent. She stopped just inside the doorway and looked around the space the way a person looks at something when they are taking a real inventory, not the polite, cursory glance of someone being courteous, but the slow, deliberate assessment of someone who is actually thinking. She looked at the workbench. She looked at the kiln. She looked at the failure log notebook, sitting open on the stool, 214 entries visible in my handwriting from where she stood. Then she looked at me. "Show me the battery," she said. No introduction. No small talk. No comment on the rust stains on the walls or the fact that her heels were sinking slightly into the uneven concrete. "Just show me the battery." I liked her immediately. Her name was Elena Rostova. She told me this after, not before, examining the prototype. She ran a mid-sized hedge fund out of New York, had spent 22 years investing in technology and infrastructure, and had a reputation in her industry, I would later learn, for making exactly 3 calls that everyone else thought were insane and being right all 3 times. She was somewhere in her early 50s with silver threading through dark hair. She wore pulled back, and the kind of focused energy that made the air in a room feel slightly more alert. She held the test cell in both hands for 15 minutes. She did not speak during those 15 minutes. She turned it over, examined the casing, connected it to my multimeter, and read the discharge curve herself. Checked my logged data against the live reading. At one point, she set the cell down, picked up my failure log, and read 6 pages of it without asking permission. I stood against the far wall with my arms crossed and let her work. Finally, she set everything down, straightened up, and looked at me with an expression I could not immediately classify. It was not excitement, it was something more controlled than that something that had been through enough disappointment to know better than to lead with feeling. "How long did the 48th prototype hold?" she asked. 72 hours, 14 minutes, I said. Continuous discharge under a 40-watt load. No degradation in the final 12 hours. Elena nodded slowly. Standard lithium-ion under the same load would give you 8 to 10 hours before significant degradation. You're looking at roughly 8 times that. Closer to 9, I said. Something shifted in her face then, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I don't invest in technology. I've watched too many brilliant technologies fail because the person behind them couldn't hold the room long enough to get them built." She paused. "I invest in people who refuse to die. And I have been watching you post on that forum for 2 years. She picked up her bag. $2 million. No equity conditions for the first 18 months. You build, you hire, you get this into production. Then we talk terms. My throat tightened. I had not expected the number to be that large. I had been prepared to argue for 50,000 and a handshake. "Why?" I said. It was the only word I could manage. Elena looked at me steadily. "Because the data doesn't lie," she said. "And because anyone who keeps a failure log that detailed for 6 years in a shipping container in Detroit is either the most disciplined engineer I've ever met or the most stubborn human being alive." She tilted her head slightly. "Possibly both." I laughed, a short, involuntary sound that surprised me. My eyes went hot at the corners, and I turned briefly toward the workbench on the pretense of checking something so she would not see it. I was 67 years old, and I was blinking back tears in a rust-stained container because a woman I had met 20 minutes ago had looked at my work and called it worth $2 million. Some things a man does not have the right words for. He just has to let them happen. Vance Green Tech was incorporated in the state of Michigan in March of 2021. We leased proper lab space 3 blocks from the container by April, hired our first 2 engineers, both recent graduates from the University of Michigan's Materials Science program, by May, and had a working production prototype ready for external testing by the end of summer. I had not seen Marcus since he was 11 years old, my brother's grandson, a quiet boy with serious eyes who used to take apart his grandmother's appliances to see how they worked. He was 26 now, newly graduated from the University of Michigan Law School, and he stood in the doorway of my lab with a manila folder under his arm and the expression of someone who had been working up to a conversation for a very long time. Something inside me went very still. "Come in," I said. He walked in, set the folder on my workbench, and sat down on the stool I pointed him to. And then he told me in the careful and precise language of a young lawyer who had spent 8 months building a case the outline of what I would later read in full, the dementia, filing, the guardianship, the $2 million, all of it. His voice stayed even throughout, but his jaw was tight, and his eyes were bright. And when he finished, he looked at me like a man waiting to find out if he had done the right thing by coming. "How long did this take you to put together?" I asked. 8 months, he said. Nights and weekends while I was finishing my last semester. I looked at my great-nephew across the workbench. This young man who owed me nothing, who had been a child when all of it happened, who had gone and built a legal file on behalf of a man the rest of the family had apparently decided was gone, and felt something crack open in my chest, so wide it nearly took my breath. "Thank you," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. Marcus nodded once quickly, like he was afraid that if we sat in the moment too long, it would get away from us. "One more thing," he said. He pulled a single document from the folder. "I filed a competency confirmation with Wayne County Circuit Court last month. Your legal standing in Michigan is completely clean. Whatever they filed in Georgia, it stops at the state line." He had done it before I even knew I needed it. One of the first things Marcus did when he arrived was build the legal foundation that would protect everything we were about to build quietly, without announcement, the way a good engineer reinforces a structure before it has to bear weight. The next 2 years moved the way good work moves, when the conditions are finally right, fast, and certain and full of small daily problems that felt enormous in the moment and irrelevant a week later. The $4.7 million contract with a Michigan electric vehicle manufacturer came through in the spring of 2022. Our battery cells outperforming every competing product in their stress tests by a margin their own engineers described in the post-test report as not currently explainable by existing industry benchmarks. I framed that sentence and hung it on the wall of the lab. In September of 2023, the Wall Street Journal ran a cover story on the clean energy sector. In the center of the page above the fold was a photograph of our lab. The headline read, "Vance Green Tech and the battery that shouldn't exist." Marcus set the paper on my desk that morning without saying a word. He didn't need to. He sat across from me and we both looked at that front page. This young man who had driven 12 hours to find me, and the old engineer he had found in a shipping container, and every single thing that had happened between that empty Atlanta kitchen and this moment passed between us without needing language. "Marcus," I said finally, "we both know that somewhere out there somebody is going to recognize that name." Marcus looked at me steadily. "Yes," he said, "they are." He set the paper down and reached back into the manila folder. "Now," he said quietly, "let me show you the rest." Marcus never did finish showing me the rest of that folder that afternoon, because at 4:57 in the evening, while he was reaching for the last section of documents, my phone rang for the first time. I looked at the screen. A New York number I did not recognize. I set the phone face down on the desk and nodded at Marcus to continue. It rang again at 5:03, then at 5:11, then twice more before 6 o'clock. By the time Marcus and I had finished going through the remaining documents, the parts he had warned me were worse than the money. And he had been right. I had 7 missed calls from 3 different New York numbers I had never seen before. I never answered a single one of those calls. But I listened to every voicemail, and what I heard told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man my son had become. Let me explain what was happening on Julian's end, because Marcus spent the next 2 days piecing it together from sources I will not fully name. The Wall Street Journal had run our cover story in September of 2023, that much you already know. But Julian, as best as Marcus could determine, had seen the article and dismissed it. Vance Greentech was a Michigan battery company. His father's name was a common enough name. He had told himself it was a coincidence or had chosen not to look too carefully, which is a different thing entirely. What changed in November of 2024 was not the article. What changed was the money. Julian's company, Apex Components, a mid-sized industrial supply firm based in Manhattan, had spent the better part of 3 years making aggressive margin trades on the strength of contracts it did not fully have. A margin trade works like this: you borrow money from a broker to buy more stock than you can actually afford, betting that the price will rise fast enough for you to pay back the loan and keep the profit. When it works, it looks like genius. When it does not work, the broker calls in the loan immediately, that is the margin call, and if you cannot pay everything, gets liquidated whether you are ready or not. By the first Monday of November 2024, Apex Components was staring down a $47 million margin call due the following week. It was in that moment of pure financial terror Marcus told me that Julian finally typed his father's full name into a search engine. I can only imagine what it felt like to watch those results load. The voicemails started that same evening. I listened to all 113 of them over the course of 2 sittings with Marcus beside me, taking notes in his careful, precise handwriting. And I want to tell you what I heard, because I think it matters not as evidence but as a portrait of a person. The first 30 calls came in waves of desperation. Julian's voice in those early messages was the voice of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and then abandoned the script the moment he heard the beep. "Dad, it's Julian. I know we haven't spoken. I know that's on me. Dad, please pick up. I know Mom made choices that were wrong. I know that. I need you to know that I know that. Please call me back." Then an hour later, "Dad, I need you to understand I was 25 when Mom made those decisions. I didn't understand the full picture. I was trying to hold things together. Please. I'm your son." I sat in my office chair listening to those first messages with my elbows on my knees and my hands pressed together in front of my mouth, and I will not pretend it did not move something in me. Because it did. Julian's voice in those first calls was the voice of a 35-year-old man, yes, but underneath it, in the cadence of the fear, I could hear the echo of someone much younger. The boy I had carried to bed. The boy I had taught to read a circuit diagram. That boy was somewhere inside those messages. Buried under 35 years of choices, but still there. "You okay?" Marcus asked quietly, watching my face. "Keep going," I said. The second phase began around call 31. The desperation had curdled into something harder. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, but I will go to the press. I have documentation that your company used proprietary research methodologies that were developed on family time and family resources. You want to play hardball? We can play hardball." Then an hour after that, "I have lawyers, Dad. Real ones. If you don't call me back by tomorrow morning, I'm filing a formal challenge to your company's intellectual property claims. Don't think I won't." Marcus looked up from his notes when that one finished. "He has no legal basis for an IP claim," he said flatly. "Every piece of research you produced was developed independently, documented in notebooks, predating any family connection, and the timeline destroys any argument of shared resources." "I know," I said. "He knows too," Marcus said. "He's just hoping you don't." The third phase was the hardest to listen to, not because it was threatening, but because it was simply broken. By call 70, Julian's voice had lost all its architecture. The pauses were too long. The sentences did not finish. Once in call 84, I heard him breathing for 11 seconds before he said anything at all. And what he said was, "Dad, I don't know how this happened. I don't know how we got here." That one I listened to 3 times. Marcus told me what else his sources had picked up from Julian's end. Victoria had called Julian within an hour of his first search, and the two of them had made a decision together. They would go to New York. They would find David in person. Julian had apparently said, "We'll make him understand that family takes care of family." Victoria had said, "He owes us." Sloane, Julian's wife, a woman I had never met whose existence I had learned about only through Marcus's research, had reportedly stood in the doorway of their bedroom while Julian packed an overnight bag and said nothing. But Marcus's source told him that after Julian left the room, Sloane had sat down on the edge of the bed and stayed there for a very long time. Something about that detail lodged in my mind and stayed there. The 113th voicemail arrived at 11:47 on Tuesday night. Julian's voice was so hoarse by then it was almost unrecognizable. "Last try, Dad. Last one. After this, I'm done trying." That was all. No threat. No plea. Just a man announcing his own exhaustion to a machine. I set the phone down on the desk and looked at Marcus. "They're coming here," I said. "Yes," Marcus said. "Probably by the end of the week." "Good," I said, and I heard the steadiness in my own voice like something I had been saving for a long time. "Then we're ready." I picked up my phone and made one call, not to Julian, not to Victoria. The person I called had silver-streaked hair and the most precise investment instincts I had ever encountered, and she answered on the second ring because she had been waiting for this call since September of 2023. "Elena," I said. "They found me." A beat of silence. Then her voice calm and certain as a closing transaction. "I know, I've been watching the Apex margins for 3 weeks. Tell me what you need," I told her. That Monday evening at the Plaza Hotel, I was standing on a stage holding a glass trophy for clean energy innovation when the back doors of the grand ballroom burst open, and just like that, 10 years collapsed into a single room. The event was the Northeast Clean Energy Leadership Awards, black tie, 600 attendees, the kind of gathering where the chandeliers cost more than most people's cars, and the waitstaff moves through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of professionals who have learned not to exist between orders. I had been on stage for approximately 4 minutes, trophy in hand, halfway through a prepared acceptance speech I had written myself, because I do not trust speechwriters to say what I actually mean, when the doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open hard enough to draw every head in the room. Victoria came in first. I want to be precise about what I saw, because precision matters here. She walked down the center aisle of that ballroom, with her arms slightly open and her face already crumpling, already performing tears rolling down her cheeks, before she had taken 10 steps, one hand pressed to her chest, like a woman in genuine anguish. She was wearing a dark blue dress and pearls, and she moved with the particular kind of theatrical grief that requires an audience to function. 600 people turned to watch her, and she gave them everything they were looking for. "David," she called out, her voice breaking on the single word with devastating precision. "David, please, I just need a moment. I just need to speak to my husband." The room stirred. Someone near the front touched another person's arm. I heard a woman 2 tables from the stage say softly, "Oh, that poor thing." I stood on that stage with the glass trophy in my hand, and felt something I had not expected. Not anger, not satisfaction, but a strange and crystalline calm, the kind that comes when you have been preparing for a moment so long that when it finally arrives, it feels less like a crisis and more like the answer to a question you have been holding for years. Julian came in behind her 3 steps back with a man in a gray suit carrying a leather portfolio. A lawyer from the look of the portfolio and the careful blankness of his face. Julian was dressed well, a new charcoal suit with a tie that matched too precisely the outfit of a man who had spent time on his appearance because he needed to feel armored. He did not look like his mother. He was not performing grief. He was scanning the room with the focused, rapid assessment of someone calculating odds. Behind Julian, stepping confidently through the doors, was a man in a suit that was slightly too expensive for the building. Heavy-set late 50s. He placed his hand familiarly on the small of Victoria's back as she wiped her fake tears. I recognized him from the photos Marcus had shown me. Christian Pierce, the financial broker, the lover she had sold our home for. I stepped off the stage. The room was still buzzing, 600 people at round tables, all of them uncertain whether they were witnessing a family emergency or something else entirely. I crossed the ballroom floor toward Marcus, who had read the situation in approximately 2 seconds and was already moving toward the side doors, with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of a man who understood exactly what needed to happen next. "Get the press out," I said quietly as I passed him. "All of them, politely but completely." Marcus nodded once and changed direction without breaking stride. It took 4 minutes. The journalists there were 11 of them, I counted later. Credentials from 6 different publications were guided out through the side entrance with the apologetic professionalism of event staff who had been trained for exactly this kind of situation. The 600 guests followed in small groups as Marcus and the venue coordinator moved through the room with quiet urgency, redirecting people to the reception area down the hall, where they were told the evening would continue momentarily. Victoria was still performing for the departing crowd, one hand extended toward me, her voice carrying beautifully across the emptying room. "He's my husband. We've been separated, that's all. A family misunderstanding. I just need 5 minutes." The last guest filed out. The last side door closed. The room went from 600 people to 6, me, Victoria, Julian, the gray-suited lawyer Marcus, and 1 venue security officer stationed at the main door. The change in Victoria was immediate and total. She lowered her hand. She reached into her clutch and produced a small, folded tissue, and she used it to dab carefully, not at tears, because the tears had already stopped, but at the edges of her mascara, with the focused attention of a woman doing touch-up work. When she looked up again, the grief was gone. What replaced it was a flatness behind the eyes that I recognized that I had been seeing in small doses for decades without ever naming it clearly. This was who she actually was. The performance in the ballroom had been the costume. This was the face underneath. "Well," she said, her voice perfectly even, that cleared the room nicely. Julian stepped forward and placed his portfolio on the nearest table. He snapped it open with practiced efficiency and removed a document thick-bound, tabbed with colored markers. "Dad," Julian said, and the word came out of his mouth with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided to use a word as a tool rather than mean it. "We're not here to fight. We're here to make a business proposal. 30% equity in Vance Green Tech transferred to a family trust in exchange for our agreement not to release the medical documentation to the press." He slid the document across the table toward me. I looked at my son standing there in his armored suit with his lawyer and his colored tabs and his 30%. And I looked at my ex-wife touching up her mascara at the edge of a ballroom where 4 minutes ago she had been weeping for 600 strangers, and something moved through my chest that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, and not quite satisfaction. It was something more complex than any of those. The compound emotion of a man looking clearly for the first time in a very long time at exactly what something is. I picked up the bound document. I looked at the cover page. I set it back down. Then I smiled, not a warm smile, not a forgiving one. The particular smile of a man who has been holding a very specific kind of patience for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "What's funny?" she said sharply. "Nothing," I said. "Nothing at all." She mistook my calm for calculation. I could see it in the way her shoulders dropped a fraction, the way she leaned back slightly in her chair. The posture of a woman who believed she was watching a man figure out the cost of making her go away. She had no idea I had been calculating something else entirely for the past 10 years. I let them finish. I let Julian lay out every clause of that equity transfer document. The 30%, the family trust structure, the confidentiality agreement that would require me to sign a statement acknowledging the medical records as legitimate. I let Victoria nod along from her chair with the practiced confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. I let the gray-suited lawyer uncap his pen and set it on the table in front of me with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to people picking it up. Then I said the 7 words that changed the entire direction of that room. Before we discuss percentages, let's talk about the loan. Julian's hand stopped moving. It did not flinch, did not jerk, it simply stopped, the way a machine stops when the power is cut mid-motion and immediate. "What loan?" he said. "The $500,000 loan originated in New York on October 14th, 2014, I said. "The one taken out in my name. The one signed at 3:15 in the afternoon." Victoria set down this glass of water she had been holding. The sound of it touching the table was very precise in the quiet room. I nodded at Marcus. Marcus reached into the leather portfolio he had carried in from the car, the same portfolio he had packed that afternoon, before we left the office while I was on the phone with Elena, and removed a single sheet of paper in a clear plastic sleeve. He set it on the table and slid it across to the center, where everyone at the table could see it. It was the certified copy of my Fulton County intake record. Harrison's rubber stamp was visible in the upper right corner, dark and official, and completely unambiguous. The timestamp at the top read October 14th, 2014, intake 11:47 a.m., release October 15th, 2014, 10:22 a.m. "I was in police custody in Atlanta when that loan was signed," I said. "Picked up for vagrancy at Centennial Olympic Park at 11:47 in the morning. Released the following day at 10:22. The loan document was signed in a Manhattan bank at 3:15 in the afternoon, 4 hours after I was already sitting in a Fulton County holding cell 4 states away." The room processed this. Julian's lawyer leaned forward and looked at the document. I watched his eyes move across the page, the date, the timestamps, the official seal, and I watched the careful blankness of his professional face develop a small, involuntary crack. Julian pushed his chair back slightly from the table. Not standing up, just creating distance, the unconscious movement of a person whose body has decided it wants options. "That document doesn't prove anything about the loan," he said. His voice had lost its earlier precision. The edges were fraying. "Lots of people have the same name. It could be a—" "The loan was taken out using my social security number," I said. "My date of birth. My Georgia driver's license number, the license that was in my wallet when I was processed at Fulton County at 11:47 that morning." I paused. The intake officer logged my identification documents. They are listed on page 2 of that report. Julian closed his mouth. "The loan officer who processed the application," I continued, "was a man named Tom Shelby, then employed at a commercial lending branch in Midtown Manhattan. Mr. Marcus here has documentation showing that Mr. Shelby received 3 wire transfers from an account connected to Apex Components in the 60 days prior to the loan application. The first transfer arrived 9 days before the application was submitted. The last one arrived 2 days after it was approved." Victoria's face had gone the color of old chalk. She was gripping the arms of her chair with both hands, and I could see the tension in her knuckles from where I sat. Julian's lawyer leaned close to his client's ear and said something in a voice too low to carry across the table. Julian shook his head sharply, a single tight motion. It was at this moment that I became aware of the woman sitting in the far corner of the room. I had noticed her when Julian came in, a woman in her early 30s, dark-haired, dressed more quietly than Victoria, who had taken a seat at the round table in the corner of the ballroom, without introducing herself or being introduced. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her, and a pen she had not yet used. I had assumed she was part of Julian's legal team. I had been watching her peripherally throughout the exchange, the way you watch something that has not moved yet, but might. Now she was writing. Her name, I would learn in the next few minutes, was Sloane Julian's wife, of 4 years present tonight, at her own insistence for reasons that were becoming clearer by the second. Julian seemed to notice her writing at the same moment I did. Sloane, he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge that was clearly not the first time it had carried that edge in her direction. You don't need to. I'm taking notes, Sloane said without looking up. Her voice was even and quiet, and carried the particular quality of a woman who has made a decision and is no longer interested in being talked out of it. Sloane, you told me, she said, and now she did look up, and the look on her face stopped Julian's sentence where it stood. You told me that you gave him money to start over. When I asked you about the company, about the lawsuit, about all of it, you told me your father had taken family money, and you were just trying to get it back. Her voice did not rise. It did not shake, but it had the precision of something that has been held at a controlled temperature for a very long time and has just reached its limit. You told me you were helping him. Julian opened his mouth, then he closed it again. I watched my son search for a version of the truth that would work in this room with this woman in front of this document, and I watched him come up empty. It was not a satisfying thing to see. It was not the clean, uncomplicated victory that people imagine revenge to be. It was the sight of a 35-year-old man discovering in real time that the story he had been telling about himself had run out of road. Julian, his lawyer said quietly, touching his arm. Julian shook him off. Sloane capped her pen. She looked across the room at me with an expression I could not fully interpret, not quite an apology, not quite an alliance, but something that lived in the territory between them. Something that had just made a choice about which side of a line it was standing on. I watched her face move through 5 different emotions in less than 3 seconds. I had seen that look before. It was the look of a person whose entire foundation had just shifted underneath them, who was already beginning quietly and irrevocably to figure out what to do about it. She was not finished yet, but she had started to choose a different side. Victoria had been quiet for too long. In 41 years of marriage, I had learned one reliable truth about my ex-wife. Her silences were never empty. They were loading screens. The longer she went without speaking, the larger whatever was coming was going to be. She had been sitting perfectly still since Sloane put down her pen. Watching. Processing. Recalibrating the way a person recalibrates when the approach they prepared is no longer the approach they need. Julian was still trying to recover from the exchange with his wife. His lawyer was whispering something urgent into his ear, and nobody in the room was paying attention to Victoria. That was always when she moved. She stood up, reached into the large, structured handbag she had set on the chair beside her, and removed a manila envelope. She held it in front of her with both hands, and the way she held it deliberately, like an exhibit, told me this was the move she had been saving. The one she believed would end the conversation. This, she said, her voice returned to its earlier composure, is a certified copy of a medical evaluation conducted by Dr. Arthur Pendleton, a licensed neurologist with 30 years of practice in Manhattan. It documents moderate to severe cognitive decline with delusional ideation evaluated and confirmed in November of 2014. She set the envelope on the table and pushed it toward the center. If this reaches the press, and I have 3 journalists' personal numbers in my phone right now, Vance Greentech does not survive the week. No investor holds through a story about a company being run by a man with documented dementia. The room waited. I did not move. I did not reach for the envelope. I sat with my hands flat on the table in front of me and looked at Victoria with the same expression I had been wearing for the past 40 minutes, and I watched her read my stillness as weakness. This is your choice, she said, gaining confidence from my lack of reaction, her voice picking up pace the way it always did when she believed she was winning. 30% signed tonight, and this document disappears. Or I make 3 calls before I leave this building, and your company is finished by morning. I said nothing. I simply looked at her. Victoria frowned. She had expected something protest calculation, visible distress. My calmness was not the response the script called for, and she did not know what to do with it. So she did what people do when a script fails them. She escalated. I know you think you've been clever, she said, and the composure was starting to thin, now the real voice beginning to push through the performance. I know you think that little police report changes something. It doesn't. What changes something is this. She tapped the envelope, and every publication in New York will run it. You think Elena Rostova keeps her money in a company whose founder can't be trusted. You think those government contracts survive this story. Still, I said nothing. Julian was watching his mother with an expression I recognized, not quite alarm, but the specific alertness of a person watching someone they know walk toward a line that should not be crossed. He knew Victoria. He knew what she looked like when the mechanism that usually governed her speech was starting to slip. Mom, he said quietly, a warning wrapped in a single word. Victoria ignored him. Her eyes were fixed on me, and there was something happening in those eyes now, the frustration of a woman who had spent 41 years knowing how to read this man and was suddenly unable to. You know what your problem always was, David? Her voice had lost its boardroom polish entirely. It was something raw, now older the voice that existed before the performance. You always thought that being right was the same as winning. It isn't. Winning is having the leverage, and I have the leverage. Victoria, Julian said sharper now. He needs to understand that this— Mom, stop! That dementia file should have locked you in Atlanta for good. The words came out of her with the velocity of something that had been under pressure for too long. Her voice cracked on the last word, not with grief, but with the fracture of a person who has finally said the true thing out loud instead of the strategic thing. We had everything arranged. The petition was filed, the order was granted, you were supposed to disappear. That was the plan. You were supposed to be gone. The room went absolutely still. Sloane's pen had stopped moving on her legal pad. Julian had closed his eyes, not in relief, not in anger, but in the particular way a person closes their eyes when they have been dreading something for a long time, and it has finally arrived. Victoria seemed to hear what she had just said. I watched it happen, the slight widening of the eyes, the almost imperceptible intake of breath, the rapid internal calculation of what those words meant in the context of where she was standing and who was in the room. Her gaze moved from my face to the table. There was a small rectangular device in the center of the conference table, set flush into the surface part of the Plaza Hotel's built-in presentation system, a microphone panel for the room's audio equipment. A red indicator light on its face was blinking steadily. It had been blinking since we sat down. I had noticed it when I first walked to the table, and I had said nothing about it, and I had not touched it. Victoria stared at that blinking red light for 3 full seconds. I let her look at it. Then I looked at her. When our eyes met, I spoke for the first time in several minutes, and I kept my voice completely level because what I was feeling in that moment was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complete, the feeling of a very long equation finally balancing itself out. Thank you, Victoria, I said. I was hoping you'd say that out loud. Her mouth opened. Then it closed. The envelope with Dr. Pendleton's report was still on the table between us, and she was staring at it now, as if seeing it for the first time, not as a weapon, but as evidence. Her own exhibit in her own hand sitting on a table next to a live microphone. Julian put both hands over his face. I stood up slowly, smoothed the front of my jacket, and looked around the room. I think that's enough for tonight, I said. You should all go home. Get some rest. I sent them home without showing my hand. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that a recording device was not the only thing that had been running in that room all evening. The next 48 hours were the most important hours of my life, and I spent most of them sitting in the dark, drinking bad coffee, and watching Marcus turn their empire inside out, one document at a time. We left the Plaza Hotel at 9:47 on Monday night. The car ride back to the Vance Green Tech offices on the 43rd floor of a building on 6th Avenue took 11 minutes. Marcus spent those 11 minutes on his phone fingers, moving fast across the screen, setting things in motion that he had clearly been thinking about since before we walked into that ballroom. I sat beside him and watched the city move past the window Manhattan at 10 o'clock on a Monday, still lit up and restless, indifferent to the fact that something significant had just occurred in one of its hotels. "We have until Friday," I said. "I know," Marcus said without looking up from his phone. "Is that enough time?" He looked up then. In the glow of the passing streetlights, his face was tired, but completely focused, the face of a man who has been preparing for exactly this sprint and has been waiting for the starting gun. "It's enough," he said. "I've been building toward this for 8 months. I just needed tonight to happen first." He went back to his phone. I looked back out the window. By midnight, Marcus had set up a working station in the conference room, 3 monitors, 2 laptops, a printer running continuously in the corner, and enough coffee to keep a small newsroom awake until morning. I sat across the table from him, with my own notebook, the old paper kind, and we worked. The financial trail Marcus had been assembling for months came into sharp focus over those first hours. What had looked in pieces like a complex web of transactions became, when laid out sequentially across the conference table, something almost elegant in its simplicity. The money had moved in a circle. It had started as legitimate retirement savings mine and Victoria's joint annuity $2,140,000, and it had been converted into cash through the fraudulent guardianship proceeding. From Victoria's hands, it had moved to Christian Pierce, who ran a financial brokerage in Midtown Manhattan, and whose specialty Marcus had determined over 8 months of careful research was making money appear to come from places it had not come from. "Pierce took his cut," Marcus said, pulling up a spreadsheet on the center monitor and turning it so I could see. 14% taken in 3 transfers over 6 months. Then he moved the remainder into Apex components through a series of vendor payment accounts, made to look like legitimate supplier invoices. 22 invoices over 18 months, each one just under the federal reporting threshold. The federal reporting threshold for cash transactions that trigger automatic bank reporting is $10,000. Keeping transactions just below that threshold is called structuring, and it is a federal crime under 31 U.S.C. Section 5324, regardless of whether the underlying money was obtained legally. "They were careful," I said. "They were careful the first time," Marcus said. "After that, they got comfortable, and comfortable people get sloppy." He pulled up a second spreadsheet. Starting in 2018, the transfers got larger and less frequent. By 2021, Pierce was moving money in 6-figure chunks. The structuring stopped. They stopped being careful because nothing had happened yet, and they assumed nothing would. I looked at the numbers on the screen. 4 years of increasingly bold transfers, each one leaving a cleaner, more traceable record than the last. Julian had inherited his mother's confidence. That was always his most dangerous quality. "Tom Shelby," I said. "Found him," Marcus said, and there was a satisfaction in those 2 words that he did not bother to conceal. "He's been operating under the name Thomas Bell out of a small brokerage office in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Has been since 2016, about a year after the loan was processed. The office is registered to a Shell LLC, but the filing address matches an apartment that has been rented continuously since 2016 to a woman named Patricia Bell, which is the name of his mother, who died in 2019. Marcus paused. He's been hiding in plain sight under his own mother's name. I rubbed the bridge of my nose. Ann Pendleton. Still practicing, Marcus said, and something in his voice sharpened. 4 clinics, all in the tri-state area, all nominally independent, all ultimately traceable to a parent LLC that has Julian Vance listed as a silent investor. The clinics have been running since 2017. They bill insurance companies for procedures that are either grossly overpriced or never performed. He's been laundering money through those clinics for 7 years. Your diagnosis was the opening transaction. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan does at 2 in the morning. Running still at a lower frequency, the lights never fully going off, the city never fully going quiet. I pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and looked at the street 60 floors below and thought about a man sleeping on a park bench in Atlanta in October 2014 with 47 pages of battery research notes tucked inside a cardboard tube in his backpack. "Elena," I said. "It's 2 in the morning, Marcus said. "I know." I picked up my phone. She answered on the second ring. Of course she did. "I was wondering when you'd call," Elena said. No sleep in her voice. I doubted she had tried. "I need to tell you something," I said. And then I told her the thing I had not told anyone. Not Marcus, not Harrison, not a single person in the 10 years since I had stood in that empty kitchen. I told her that it was never about the money. That I had spent a decade in a shipping container, not because I was trying to prove something to Victoria or Julian, but because the work was real, and the work deserved to exist, and the only way to honor the work was to finish it. That some mornings in Detroit, I had woken up on a cot in a container in January, with frost on the inside of the walls, and thought about stopping. That I had not stopped. There was a silence on the line. Then Elena said, in a voice that was quieter than her usual register, "I know David. I always knew. That's why I wrote the check." My eyes burned. I turned further toward the window so Marcus would not see my face. "I need you to be ready to move on the margins," I said when I had my voice back. "Already positioned," she said. "Give me the signal and I'll pull the trigger." "Friday morning," I said. "Friday morning," she confirmed. "Good night, David." I set the phone down and stood at the window for another minute, breathing steadily. Then I went back to the table. At 2:17 in the morning on Wednesday, the front desk called up from the lobby. Marcus answered. I watched his expression change as he listened, not alarm exactly, but a sharpening of attention, the look he got when something unexpected had just become relevant. He said, "Tell her to leave it at the desk. We'll come down." He hung up and looked at me. "There's a woman downstairs," he said. "She won't come up. She left a USB drive at the front desk and a handwritten note." He read from his phone screen where the lobby attendant had typed out the message. "Give this to Mr. Vance. Tell him it's the complete audit trail, signed S." I looked at Marcus across the table. I held that USB drive in my palm for a long moment before handing it to Marcus, feeling the small weight of it lighter than it had any right to be, considering what it apparently contained. The question now was not whether Sloan had given us enough. The question was whether what was on it was enough to do what needed to be done, and to do it cleanly, completely, and in a way that would hold up in a federal court for as long as it needed to. Marcus plugged it in. Marcus plugged in the drive at 2:47 in the morning. What came up on that screen in the next 4 minutes was 10 years of financial crime laid out in a spreadsheet so detailed, so precisely organized, that it looked less like something a frightened woman had assembled in secret, and more like something a forensic accountant had spent a year building specifically for a federal courtroom. She had her license framed on the wall. The home office Julian had apparently never paid much attention to. And for the past 14 months beginning, Marcus estimated from the file dates around the time Apex components first started showing serious financial strain, she had been quietly, methodically copying every document she could access. Bank statements, wire transfer records, vendor invoices from the shell accounts Pierce had used to funnel the money, internal Apex financial reports that showed the true state of the company's books beneath the version presented to outside investors. It was as Marcus said, pulling his chair closer to the monitor and reaching for his third coffee of the night, the most comprehensive private audit trail he had ever seen. She knew, Marcus said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected but hoped was wrong. She knew for over a year. Maybe longer. She's a CPA, I said. She would have seen it in the first set of numbers Julian showed her. Marcus turned to look at me. Why didn't she go straight to the FBI? I thought about Sloane sitting in that corner of the ballroom, with her legal pad, writing carefully, while her husband's empire unraveled across the table. I thought about the woman who had reportedly sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after Julian walked out the door with his overnight bag. Because she loved him, I said. Or she used to. And when you love someone, you spend a long time hoping you're wrong about what you're seeing. You give it more time than it deserves. Marcus looked at me for a moment. Then he turned back to the screen. We worked through the rest of the night. By 5 in the morning, we had cross-referenced Sloane's documents against the financial trail Marcus had built over 8 months and found they were not just compatible, they were interlocking. Where Marcus had gaps, Sloane had records. Where Sloane's documents needed context, Marcus had the background research. Together, they formed something that was no longer just evidence of wrongdoing. They formed a complete narrative beginning to end, dollar to dollar, name to name. At 6:15 in the morning, there was a knock at the office door. Marcus opened it. The man standing in the hallway was about 45, medium build, with the kind of face that had learned long ago not to give much away. He was wearing a plain, dark suit and carrying a slim leather folder, and he looked like someone's accountant right up until you noticed the way he held himself. The particular alertness of a person who is always on some level assessing the room. "Mr. Vance," he said, looking past Marcus at me. "I'm Special Agent Robert Callahan, FBI Financial Crimes Unit. I believe your attorney reached out to my office about 6 weeks ago." He held up his credentials. "I've been waiting for the documentation to get to where it needed to be." Marcus stepped back and let him in. "Robert." He told me to use his first name, said. It made conversations move faster. Sat down at the conference table and opened his folder. He had his own documents, a parallel investigation his unit had been running on Christian Pierce for 14 months. Initially unconnected to my case, triggered by suspicious activity flags in Pierce's brokerage accounts. Pierce, it turned out, had made enemies in the financial industry long before he made one of me. "The Plaza Hotel recording from Monday night," Robert said, setting a single page on the table. "Our surveillance unit was running an audio feed from a separate device in the room, not the house system. We've had a wire authorization on Pierce for 2 months. He looked at me steadily. "Victoria Sterling's statement on that recording constitutes a voluntary confession to healthcare fraud and conspiracy. Combined with the documentation your attorney has assembled and what appears to be on this drive," he nodded toward the USB still in Marcus's laptop. "The room held that information for a moment." "All of them," I said. "Victoria Sterling, Julian Vance, Christian Pierce, Thomas Shelby. We already know where he is." Robert paused. "Dr. Pendleton is being handled separately by the Health Fraud Division. They've been building their own case on the clinic network for 3 years. This gives them everything they need to move." I looked at the warrant request document Robert had set on the table. I looked at the timestamp on Marcus's laptop, 6:22 a.m. Wednesday. I thought about Friday, about the letter I had not yet written, about the one remaining thing I needed them to do voluntarily in a room of my choosing before this ended. "Not yet," I said. Robert looked at me. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened slightly. "Mr. Vance, 2 more days," I said. "I need them to come to me, willingly. I need them to walk in believing they've already won." I looked at him directly. "Can you hold the warrant until Friday morning?" Robert considered this for a moment, with the careful, measured patience of a man who has learned that rushing a well-built case is how you lose it. "The warrant will be signed tonight regardless," he said. "Holding the execution is your call, not mine. But if anyone runs—" "Nobody's running," I said. "They think I'm the one who's cornered." Robert studied me for another moment. Then he picked up his folder and stood. "Friday morning," he said. It was not a question. "Friday morning," I said. He nodded once, picked up his coffee from the edge of the table. He had brought his own, in a plain travel mug, which somehow told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person he was, and walked to the door. "One more thing," I said. He turned. The senator, Jonathan Mercer. I had been sitting on this name for 2 days, turning it over, deciding what to do with it. Mercer had been Pierce's political connection, the man whose influence had kept certain regulatory eyes looking elsewhere for years. Marcus had found the connection 4 months ago. He needs to be given the opportunity to cooperate before Friday, not after. Robert's expression did not move. "He already has," he said simply, and then he walked out. Marcus and I looked at each other across the conference table. Then Marcus let out a long breath, leaned back in his chair, and pressed both hands over his face. "There was one more thing I needed to do before Friday morning," I said. "I needed to give them a reason to come to me willingly, confidently, and without their lawyers telling them to run." I pulled a piece of Vance Green Tech letterhead from the printer tray and uncapped my pen. Thursday morning I wrote the most dishonest letter of my life. It was also without question the most effective. I wrote it in 2 drafts. The first draft took 40 minutes. Clean professional measured the language of a businessman extending an olive branch to a family in crisis. I read it back and found it too obviously generous, the kind of letter that would make a careful person suspicious. So I wrote the second draft. I made it slightly less generous. I put a faint trace of reluctance into the tone, just enough to suggest that this concession was costing me something, that I was making it despite my better judgment, that I was in the end a man who still valued family over victory. That version I sent. The letter went out by private courier at 10:15 Thursday morning. 3 copies, 3 destinations delivered by hand with a signed receipt required. The first copy went to Julian's apartment on the Upper West Side. The second went to the hotel in Midtown where Victoria had been staying since Monday. The third went to Christian Pierce's office on Park Avenue, a detail that would tell Pierce immediately that I knew exactly who he was and where he sat in this arrangement. The letter was written on Vance Green Tech letterhead, and it proposed the following: a private meeting at the Vance Green Tech offices on Friday morning at 9 a.m., at which David Vance would present a financial restructuring proposal that included a $50 million bridge loan to Apex Components, designed to cover the outstanding margin obligations and stabilize the company's position through the end of the fiscal year. In exchange, all parties would enter into a comprehensive settlement agreement resolving all outstanding disputes, including the matter of the equity claim through binding arbitration. On page 1, it looked like surrender. On page 3, buried in a subsection titled Conditions Precedent to Disbursement, was a single paragraph that read, "In part as a condition of the disbursement of funds described herein, all parties acknowledge that the medical records filed in the state of Georgia in calendar year 2015 pertaining to David R. Vance were based upon information that was materially inaccurate at the time of filing, and that said records do not accurately reflect the cognitive or legal capacity of David R. Vance at any point relevant to this agreement." In plain language, to receive the $50 million, Julian and Victoria had to sign a document admitting in writing that the dementia file was false. They just had to read far enough to find it, and I was counting on the fact that they would not. Marcus called me at 11:45 to tell me the courier had confirmed delivery to all 3 locations. He was quiet for a moment on the line. Then he said, "Julian called his lawyer 12 minutes after the courier left." "What did the lawyer say?" "The lawyer told him to read it carefully before responding." A pause. "Julian called back 7 minutes later and told the lawyer they were accepting." I set down my coffee cup. "He didn't read page 3. "His lawyer may have," Marcus said carefully, "but if he did, he didn't tell Julian to stop." I thought about that. A lawyer who had been hired specifically to extract a percentage from a company now watching his client about to sign away the very legal leverage that gave him value in the equation. A lawyer who might have decided quietly that a $50 million bridge loan was a better outcome for everyone, including himself, than a prolonged legal battle with an increasingly well-documented federal fraud case underneath it. "And Victoria?" I asked. Marcus's voice shifted slightly, the tone he used when something had both surprised and confirmed him at the same time. "Victoria called Pierce before she called anyone else. Pierce told her to take the meeting. His exact words, according to my source, were, 'He's scared. He's offering $50 million. That means he has something to lose.'" I sat with that for a moment. Victoria had looked at a letter offering $50 million and concluded that it was proof of weakness. That was who she was. That had always been who she was. She had looked at a man standing in an empty kitchen 10 years ago and concluded that $100 was sufficient, that the note was sufficient, that the gesture was complete. She had looked at a man and seen the ending of a story, when what she was actually looking at was the beginning of one. "All right," I said. "Let me know when they confirm." Confirmation came at 2:17 in the afternoon. All 3 parties, Julian, Victoria, and Pierce, had formally accepted the meeting via their respective representatives. 9 a.m. Friday. Vance Green Tech offices, 43rd floor. I spent the rest of Thursday afternoon on calls I will not detail here. Calls to Agent Robert, calls to Elena, one call to Harrison in Atlanta that lasted 4 minutes and ended with him saying, "I'll be watching the news on Friday, son," which was the closest thing to a declaration of affection I had ever heard from the man. By evening, the office was quiet. Marcus had gone home for the first time in 2 days. I had ordered him out at 6 o'clock, told him I needed him sharp in the morning, and that he was no good to me exhausted. He had argued for approximately 90 seconds, which was less than usual, which told me how tired he actually was. I sat alone in my office as the city darkened outside the window. I reached down and removed my left shoe. I had not taken the bill out since the night of the invitation itself, the Thursday before all of this began, when I had sat in this same chair and looked at it and thought one more day. I unwrapped the plastic carefully, the same careful motion I had performed perhaps 40 times over 10 years, and held the bill in both hands in the lamplight. It was a $100 bill that had been worn thin by a decade of being carried against the sole of a foot. The paper had softened to something almost like cloth. The edges were rounded, the face slightly blurred with age and body heat. But the back where 6 words had been written in Victoria's red ink was still legible. The ink had faded to something between rust and rose, the color of old blood, but every letter was still there. "You will figure it out." I had figured it out. It had taken 10 years, 2 cities, a shipping container, 214 failures, a hedge fund investor who believed in people more than technology, a young lawyer who had driven 12 hours to find a man his family had written off, and one very stubborn old engineer who had refused on a fundamental and perhaps unreasonable level to stop. But I had figured it out. I held the bill for a long time in the quiet of the office, feeling the worn softness of it between my fingers, and something moved through my chest that was not victory, and not grief, and not anger. It was something simpler and more complete than any of those. It was the feeling of a thing that had needed to happen finally happening. The feeling of a circle that had needed to close standing on the edge of closing. I slipped the bill back into its plastic sleeve, back into the left shoe, back where it had lived for 10 years. One more day, I said to nobody in particular, in the quiet of an office 60 floors above a city that had no idea what Friday morning was going to bring. Before I reveal the ultimate trap that brought their entire empire crashing down, drop a 100 in the comments, so I know you're still watching with me. And please be advised the upcoming events contain some fictionalized elements for dramatic and educational impact. If you prefer strictly non-fiction content, feel free to turn off the video right here. But if you stay, you're going to love this ending. Friday morning arrived the way justice always does, quietly, without ceremony, dressed like any other ordinary day. I was in the office by 6:15. I had not slept past 5, and lying in the dark rehearsing a meeting I had been preparing for 10 years was a less productive use of time than being where I needed to be. I made coffee in the small kitchen off the main hallway, stood at the window, with the cup in both hands, and watched Manhattan come awake 43 floors below. Delivery trucks on 6th Avenue, the first commuters crossing Bryant Park, the city performing its daily act of reinvention, with the indifference of something that has been doing it for centuries, and intends to keep doing it long after the particular drama unfolding on the 43rd floor today has been entirely forgotten. That indifference was something I had come to appreciate. The city did not care what happened in boardrooms. It moved regardless. That was a comfort in its way. Also, I finished my coffee and went to the conference room. Marcus was already there. He had set the room with the precision of a man who understood that environment shapes psychology. The presentation screen at the far end of the table powered down, but ready, the financial documentation arranged, face down on the side table in a specific sequence, the seating positioned, so that the door sat behind the visitors and the window framed my chair from the east. Small choices, each one deliberate. Marcus had been making deliberate choices on my behalf for 3 years, and he had never once gotten one wrong. "How are you feeling?" he asked, looking up from his laptop. "The same way I felt the morning I connected the 48th prototype," I said. "Like everything that was supposed to happen is about to happen." He looked at me for a moment. Then he smiled, a real one, unguarded, the kind that belonged to a 28-year-old who had spent the better part of a year building something no one asked him to build, and was approximately 40 minutes away from watching it work. "Good," he said, and turned back to his screen. At 8:53, the elevator opened. Julian came out first. He was wearing a new suit, charcoal gray, purchased within the last 48 hours, tie the color of old money shoes, polished that morning. His shoulders carried the deliberate set of a man who has decided consciously and in advance to project authority in a room where he believes he holds every meaningful advantage. He set his briefcase on the conference table with a definitive click and looked across the surface at me with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this moment and found his rehearsal satisfying. "Dad," he said. The word placed like a piece on a board, tactical, positioned. "Julian," I said. Victoria stepped through the elevator behind him. If Julian had come dressed for authority, Victoria had arrived for something closer to a coronation. Her hair was set. The pearls were the good ones, the ones she reserved for rooms she intended to own. The gold bangle caught the overhead light with each small movement of her wrist. She swept the conference room with the slow, appraising look of a woman who has already decided the outcome of a meeting before she has taken her seat. "David," she said, and the single word carried more satisfaction than she bothered to conceal. Christian Pierce came through the elevator last. Heavy-set late 50s, silver-streaked hair worn a fraction too long, suit priced to announce itself. He moved his eyes around the room with the rapid calculation of a man who has learned to assess exits and occupants simultaneously. His gaze found mine and held for 2 seconds, long enough to confirm what we both already knew, which was that I understood exactly who he was and exactly where he sat in the architecture of what had been done to me. I gave him a neutral expression and a slight nod toward a chair. The elevator opened one final time. Sloane came in alone. Dark slacks, plain jacket, hair pulled back. She carried nothing except a small envelope in her right hand. She did not look at Julian. She walked directly to the round table in the far corner, the same position she had chosen at the Plaza Hotel, and sat down, placing the envelope on the surface in front of her and folding both hands over it. Julian noticed her seating position. His jaw tightened. He said nothing. Julian's attorney, the gray-suited man from Monday night, had been turned away at the lobby 40 minutes earlier. The invitation had specified principals only. Julian had apparently argued the point for 6 minutes before his need to be in the room outweighed his need for counsel beside him. The money had won the argument. With men like Julian, the money always did. Pierce set the settlement contract on the table, 50 pages freshly printed, tabbed in 3 colors, and slid it toward me with the practiced ease of a man who had closed 1,000 transactions and regarded this one as already complete. "We've reviewed the terms," he said, his voice carrying the measured confidence of someone who believes himself to be the most capable intelligence in any room he enters. "Our counsel has approved. We're prepared to execute this morning." Julian lifted my pen from the table. I had placed it precisely where he would reach, and held it with the readiness of a man about to sign the document that saves everything he had spent a decade building on a fraudulent foundation. "Dad," he said, and this time the word carried something that was not quite warmth, but was the closest Julian had come to it since he walked off that elevator. "I think this is the right call. For everyone." I looked at my son with his borrowed pen and his borrowed certainty, and I said nothing for exactly 4 seconds. Not hesitation, but the specific quality of pause that tells a room to wait. Then I reached under the table and pressed the button. The lights dropped 40%. The presentation screen came alive with a low hum. What filled the 12-foot display had been assembled over 48 hours by a forensic attorney, a certified public accountant, and 8 months of painstaking investigation, a financial map so complete and precise that the room did not stir. It simply went still the way rooms go still when the thing that has been hidden is finally irrevocably shown. Every wire transfer, every Shell account, every payment to Tom Shelby, every clinic invoice from the Pendleton network, the full movement of $2,140,000 traced in colored lines from a Georgia retirement account to a Manhattan brokerage to a company registered in New York, every node labeled with names and dates and account numbers that would hold in a federal courtroom for as long as they needed to. And in the upper right corner of the screen in red block letters, Apex Components. Margin call triggered 6 a.m., all accounts frozen. Victoria's face went the color of old ash. Julian's hand remained on the pen. He did not move it. He simply looked at the screen with the expression of a man watching something he built over a decade settle quietly and completely into the ground. Pierce's eyes moved from the screen to the door, then back to the screen, then to the door again, the specific back and forth of a man running a calculation about distance and consequence. 28 feet to the door. Federal charges on the other side of every exit in the building. The calculation resolved itself. And somewhere beneath the composure he was still trying to hold together, I believe Pierce already knew how it resolved before he finished running it. I stood up for the first time all morning. It was a small movement, just a man rising from his chair. But the room shifted the way a room shifts when the thing that has been inevitable finally arrives. Julian's eyes snapped to me. Victoria straightened. Pierce, who had been in the middle of carefully reassembling his composure after the financial map appeared on the screen, went completely still. I buttoned the middle button of my jacket. 40 years of professional habit. I did not do it for effect. I did it because it was what I did when I stood up in a meeting. Then I walked to the window. Manhattan at 9 o'clock on a Friday, the buildings throwing long shadows westward, the streets below moving with the ordinary urgent business of a city that does not pause for anyone's reckoning. Somewhere down there, in a brokerage office in Midtown, the automated systems that governed Apex Components' financial accounts were continuing to do what they had been doing since 6 that morning, nothing. Every outgoing transaction blocked, every account frozen, the $47 million margin call sitting on the books like a wall with no door in it. I turned back to the room. "I didn't invite you here to negotiate," I said. "I invited you here to inform you." I looked at Julian directly. "I own your debt." The silence that followed had physical weight. Julian set down the pen he had been holding. He set it down the way a person sets something down when their hands are no longer reliable. "That's not possible," he said. "You can't just—" "Debt is bought and sold every day," I said. "The moment your creditors calculated the probability of full repayment below 60%, they were legally entitled to sell. And they did." I let that land. "You owe $47 million, Julian. Every dollar of it is owed to me." Victoria pushed back from the table. "This is illegal." "It is entirely legal," Marcus said from his position at the side of the room, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who has checked and rechecked every clause. "The documentation is on the side table. Signed, recorded, filed this morning." Victoria looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at her with an expression that meant exactly one thing. "Julian." Pierce's voice came in low and careful, the voice of a man switching from offense to self-preservation, with the speed of someone who has done it before. "Don't say another word." But Julian was no longer listening to Pierce. He was staring at the financial map still displayed on the screen, the colored lines connecting account to account. The shell company names, his own name appearing 7 times across the diagram, in connection with transactions he had believed were buried and sealed. Watching it was the same sensation I imagined as watching a building you own slowly lose its foundation. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just a quiet, irreversible settling. I nodded at Marcus. Marcus opened the side door. Senator Jonathan Mercer entered the room. About 60 years old, with the careful posture of a career politician and the expression of a man who has made a decision he knows will define the remainder of his career. He did not look at Julian or Victoria or Pierce. He walked directly to Agent Robert Callahan, who had entered behind him and placed a document folder on the table. "Consider this my formal cooperation," Senator Mercer said to no one in particular and stepped back. Julian stared at him with the expression of a man watching his last wall fall. Mercer had been the insurance policy, the political connection that had kept certain regulatory eyes pointed elsewhere for years. If Mercer was in this room standing beside a federal agent handing over documents, then the insurance policy was gone. Every mechanism they had built, every relationship they had leveraged, every layer of protection they had paid for, gone. Pierce's chair scraped back from the table. The composed, expensive confidence of the man who had stolen my savings and helped dismantle my life had completely dissolved. "It was her idea." His voice came out raw and unsteady, his finger pointing across the table at Victoria. "Victoria orchestrated everything. The medical files, the house, the money. I was only the broker. She pulled me into it." He was speaking fast now, the words tumbling forward without architecture. "I want to cooperate. I'll tell you everything." Victoria turned to look at the man she had left her family for. For the first time since she walked into that ballroom on Monday night, the performance was gone, every layer of it stripped away in the span of 10 seconds by a man who had just chosen himself over her without a moment's hesitation. Agent Robert Callahan stepped forward from the side of the room. He unfolded the warrant with the unhurried authority of a man who had been ready since 4 o'clock Wednesday morning. He looked at each of them in turn. You have the right to remain silent, he said. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Two additional agents came through the side door. The room was emptying. Pierce had been walked to the elevator first, wrists secured, briefcase left behind on the conference table like abandoned luggage. Julian had not moved from his chair. Marcus was speaking quietly with one of the agents near the side door. Senator Mercer had slipped out the way he came in, with the practiced invisibility of a man who understood that his part in this was finished. Only Victoria remained at the table, standing, the agent's hand resting lightly on her arm, waiting, because I had raised mine and said one moment. I reached into my left breast pocket and removed the plastic sleeve. I had done this motion perhaps 40 times over 10 years. In Atlanta, under a highway overpass with rain hammering the concrete above my head. In Detroit, at a workbench at 3 in the morning, with my hands so cold, the plastic slipped between my fingers. In this building 2 nights ago, alone at my desk, with the city dark outside the window. Every time the same motion, the same small rectangle of worn plastic, the same softness of a bill that had been carried against the sole of a foot through 3 years of street life and 7 years of Detroit winters. I held the sleeve for a moment. Then I sat down in my chair, bent forward, removed my left shoe, and set it on the conference table. Nobody spoke. I peeled the plastic open along the fold I had made 10 years ago and removed the bill. It came out the way old things come out, when they have been kept carefully, slowly, with a slight resistance, as though the years had made it reluctant to leave the place it had lived. I held it flat in both hands and looked at it in the Friday morning light coming through the east-facing windows. The front was faded. The serial numbers were still legible, but the portrait had blurred with age and body heat the way photographs blur when they have been handled too often. I turned it over. The back. The red ink had aged to the color of dried rust, somewhere between red and brown, the color of something that had once been vivid and had quietly settled into permanence. But every letter was still there. 6 words in Victoria's handwriting, the same looping script I had watched sign birthday cards and grocery lists, and the deed to a house in Atlanta that no longer belonged to either of us. You will figure it out. I stood up. I walked around the conference table to where Victoria was standing with the agent beside her. She watched me come toward her with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not contempt, not the performed grief of the Plaza Hotel ballroom. Something stripped of all of that. Something that was simply old and tired, and for the first time in 41 years, uncertain. I held the bill out to her. She looked at it. She looked at my hand. She looked at my face. And slowly, the way a person takes something they do not fully understand, yet she reached out and took it. I looked at her directly. Not with hatred, not with satisfaction. With the clear, uncomplicated steadiness of a man who has been waiting a very long time to return something that was never really a gift. Your lover just sold you out to the FBI to save his own skin, and New York is an expensive city to face alone, Victoria, I said. But you will figure it out. For the first time in 41 years of knowing this woman, Victoria Sterling had nothing to say. The man she had left me for had just betrayed her in front of a room full of federal agents. Not a word, not a performance, not a calculation working its way to the surface. She looked at the bill in her hand, at the 6 words she had written in red ink on a kitchen counter in Atlanta on a Tuesday morning in October 2014, words she had written with the casual cruelty of someone disposing of a problem, and something moved across her face that I will not try to name because I do not think it had a clean name. The agent touched her arm gently. She moved toward the door. She was halfway across the room when the bill slipped from her fingers. It fell the way paper falls, slowly turning once in the air, catching the light from the east windows as it went. It landed on the marble floor, face up, the back facing the ceiling, the red ink catching a shaft of Friday morning sunlight that came through the glass at a low angle and fell exactly there, as though the room had been arranged for precisely this. I looked at it on the floor. I left it there. The door closed behind Victoria and the agent. The room held the particular quiet of a space from which something large has just departed, the kind of quiet that has texture that you can feel against your skin. I stood at the window and looked at Manhattan, doing what Manhattan always does, moving indifferent, enormous forward. Julian was still in his chair. I turned away from the window and sat down across from Julian. Not at the head of the table. Across from him. Eye level. The way you sit when the time for strategy is finished. He had not moved since the agents led Victoria and Pierce out. Both hands flat on the table. Eyes down. The pen he had reached for my pen as it happened was still sitting 3 inches from his right hand untouched, since the moment the screen came on. I let the silence hold for a moment. Outside Manhattan ran its usual Friday morning frequency, indifferent, enormous forward. When Julian finally looked up, I did not see the man who had walked off the elevator 2 hours ago, with his armored suit and his colored tab documents and his borrowed confidence. That man had dissolved sometime between the financial map and the handcuffs. What was left was simply tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who has spent years holding a version of himself together and has just run out of the strength to keep doing it. "I used to watch you work," he said. His voice had roughened. "In the garage, that kiln, hours. I'd stand in the doorway and watch you." A pause. "I never told you that." My chest tightened. "I know," I said. "I could see your shadow under the door." Julian pressed his lips together. "I'm sorry, Dad. No strategy underneath it. No calculation. Just the words, stripped bare. I don't know if that changes anything, but I am." I looked at my son, 35 years old, the same boy who had laughed at a kitchen table when he finally understood a circuit diagram at age 7 and felt something ancient and unresolved move through my chest. I did not say I forgive you. I was not there yet, and I would not lie to him with easy words. "I know," I said, and I meant it to carry everything I couldn't. I stood nodded to Agent Robert at the door and did not watch Julian walk out. Some things you don't need to see to know they are real. 3 weeks after that Friday morning, I flew back to Detroit. The container was still there, same rust stains, same flat light from the single fixture overhead, same smell of cold metal and machine oil that had soaked into the walls over 7 years of work. I had kept the lease on it long after we moved into the proper lab. Some places earn the right to stay. I set a small cardboard box on the workbench and took out 3 things. The $100 bill. I had picked it up from the conference room floor before I left that Friday after everyone was gone, after the room went quiet. It had ridden in my breast pocket on the flight home like something that had finally come full circle. The certified Fulton County intake record. Harrison's rubber stamp in the upper right corner. October 14th, 2014. 11:47 a.m. The document that had waited 11 years to matter. The first page of my original battery research, notes written at the kitchen table in Atlanta on a Sunday afternoon in 2013, 14 months before Victoria left. The page where everything started. I found a plain wooden frame in the box and placed all 3 inside it side by side. I hung it above the workbench on a nail that had been there before I ever arrived. Then I stepped back and looked at it. My phone buzzed. Marcus. Pierce had taken a plea. Pendleton was cooperating. Julian had authorized his attorney to begin cooperation discussions. Sloan had been granted full immunity after 6 hours of testimony. The prosecutor called her the most prepared witness he'd seen in 20 years, Marcus said. I looked at the frame on the wall, a worn bill, a police record, a page of calculations for a battery that didn't exist yet. They thought they were burying a broken man. They buried a seed instead. I turned off the light and walked out into the December cold. Looking back over these 10 years, I realize one thing. God only tests those he knows can stand back up, but the price is always incredibly high. Please do not be like me. Do not wait until you lose absolutely everything left standing alone in the freezing winter to finally see the true colors of people. Trust is a very expensive thing. Never give it to cheap people. Family is not always blood. Sometimes family is simply the people who choose to stay when you have nothing left in your hands. I share these grandpa stories not to hold on to the past. My life is a family story filled with deep scars and cruel betrayal. But through these grandpa stories, I truly hope you learn how to protect yourself. Do not let my dark tragedy repeat in your own family story. Turn the bitter grandpa stories of this old man into solid armor and keep your beautiful family story safe and whole. Hatred might be the spark that starts the engine, but only letting go will keep the machine running forever. If you feel a connection or found a valuable lesson for yourself, please leave a comment to share your thoughts with me. Subscribing to the Revenge Dad channel and sharing this video will give me immense motivation to bring these messages to those who need support. Thank you all for watching until the very end. Warning: the upcoming videos contain fictional elements for educational purposes. If uncomfortable, please exit.